A common question that is asked is whether a Christian can become a Buddhist. Who's asking the question? Is it asked by a Buddhist or is it asked by a Christian? And who is giving the answer, a Christian or a Buddhist? If a Christian priest is answering, then the answer will be no, of course. If a Buddhist is asked, the answer will be yes, of course. And the reasons are sometimes obscured by various beliefs. From the Christian standpoint of a priest that believes in the words of the Bible without interpretation, there is no salvation but through Christian beliefs in a creator God and hell, suffering, sin, original sin, and many beliefs that are contingent upon creation and judgment, redemption, and repentance. So a Christian priest who understands little of Buddhism will forbid a Christian from being a Buddhist. He will simply advise his parishioner that Buddhism contradicts the basic tenets of Christianity. Now, from a Buddhist perspective, the view is very, very different. Not only will a Buddhist say a Christian can become a Buddhist or be a Buddhist, he will actually say it's unavoidable that a devout Christian does not become a Buddhist. All living beings, the Buddha taught, has the Buddha nature. That being so, inasmuch as a Christian is counted amongst living beings, he too, at least from the Buddha's perspective, has the Buddha nature. A Christian might call it Christ consciousness. I don't think that the Buddha would object to that. But whatever you wish to call it, we all have a sense within our heart of being of a much greater sense of being than the conventional sense of a personal self. So Of course, from a Buddhist perspective, a Christian can become a Buddhist. And from a Buddhist perspective, a Christian who adopts or studies Buddhism, it's inevitable that he will become a Buddhist and count himself as a Buddhist. In fact, a Christian who properly practices Christianity and all the tenets of the Christian faith as laid down by Christ, as many Buddhists believe Christ was an 8th stage bodhisattva. That's very high in the Buddhist hierarchy of enlightened awareness. Christ, no doubt, was a bodhisattva, a great bodhisattva. And if we are a Christian and we follow the teachings of Christ, it will take us very, very far along the Buddhist path. It will take us to a head-on collision with the idea of a creator, an individual soul, and damnation, and bring to mind the possibility of attaining realization of one's Buddha nature and transcending ideas of a creator by seeing those views as untenable upon examination. So a Christian who adopts Buddhist practice, there's certainly no contradiction involved, even if he remains a Christian, adopting Buddhist methodologies of inquiry, meditation, even if it's on a Christian deity. Buddhist methodologies of visualization, meditation can be adopted using as one's meditation topic an image of Christ or Mary in lieu of Guan Yin or Avalokiteshvara. Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. There is no God that's looking down and judging who you're worshiping. All that matters is we're looking inside of ourselves and looking for truth, finding truth within ourselves. Eventually, whether we're practicing a Christian path or a Buddhist path, we're going to question the viability of the idea of creation and an eternal living being, supreme being, separate from ourselves, but no less controlling ourselves. We will find this a contradiction. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to see that Buddhists believe in a creator just as much as Christians do. Buddhism talks about Buddha's grace and salvation and so forth, much the same as Christians do in terminology native to their faith. It's a viewpoint of separation that's deeply embedded in every human being, despite the fact that it's not viable. Ultimately, in the true sense of the word, upon examination, it cannot be sustained. The idea of an eternal, all-powerful, all-existence self, or eternal being, distinct from all other manifestations, ourselves and other people on the planet, and animals, and the whole world. The idea of a creator that's distinct from everything else is untenable. How could such a creator be known by a temporal being? If something is eternal, what knows it's eternal? If there was anything that could know something else is eternal, something other is eternal, that self would have to be eternal as well, and would collapse into the other eternal thing. There cannot be two separate eternally existing entities, separate entities. That's a false view. So the whole idea is a creation of the magic of the mind, creating illusions of eternal souls, so to speak. Individual souls existing, each independent of the other for eternity. Such selves simply do not exist in the Buddhist tradition. They're just conventionalities created by our own imagination. Just like the idea of a creator is. So getting back to the question, what can a Christian become a Buddhist? Well, we could even ask, can a Buddhist become a Buddhist? Because to be a really true Buddhist means that we develop our understanding higher than the level of our fellow Christians, which is very, 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 very high on the Buddhist hierarchy. And most of us haven't gotten there yet. I certainly haven't. The Christian path, even with its notion of a creator, can take one as far as an 8th-stage bodhisattva. Most people who are practicing the Buddhist path can only dream of attaining that kind of a state. So whether one is a Buddhist or a Christian, until one becomes an 8th-stage bodhisattva, one doesn't have to worry about the distinction of Buddhism and Christian. They're pointless distinctions. It just depends on one's own understanding. A devout and true living Buddhist, like some of the great desert fathers, Thomas Merton comes to mind, who studied a good deal of Buddhism. Most of them have gone much further than most Buddhists have, even within the Christian tradition. Eventually, they would have to leave their Christianity behind. That is true. There's no doubt about it. But they would do it through understanding of the lack of viability of a creator. And when they come to that point, which is very, very far along the line, then they will give up that view and actually become a true Buddhist. But until that time comes, they certainly can employ Buddhist techniques, as Thomas Merton did, and many other desert fathers. Whether they call themselves Buddhist or not, they also practice many of the Buddhist techniques of meditation, visualization, ascetic practices, and so forth, to get as far as they did in their own practice. His Holiness the Dalai Lama was a friend of Thomas Merton, and he was a friend of many of the Desert Fathers. And he remarked publicly that he's amazed how far along the Bodhisattva path his Christian brothers were. And they didn't even think of themselves as Buddhist at all. So whether a Buddhist or a Christian, or whether a Buddhist has a distinct advantage over a Christian as far as attaining enlightenment goes, how it's answered depends on how the question is framed. If it's framed from a Christian perspective, no. The answer is no. But from a Buddhist perspective, the answer is yes, because a Christian, there already are many Christians that are much further along the Buddhist path than many of us who've been practicing for years. Maybe they don't call themselves Buddhists, maybe they call themselves Christian. But as far as realization goes, and generating good positive karma for positive rebirth goes, they're much further along than most of us. Many are. But for a person, an ordinary person, if one is a Christian and just a ordinary Christian, not a desert father or any advanced Christian, and wonders whether it's okay to become a Buddhist or to study Buddhism. Well, from the Buddhist perspective, the answer is yes. And any Buddhist master or any person that's a Buddhist that knows anything about Buddhism whatsoever will say the answer is yes. Because to say the answer is no is to deny the teaching of the Buddha that all living beings have the Buddha nature. So naturally, since all living beings have the Buddha nature, and since Christians are counted amongst all living beings, then it follows that everybody has the right and the capacity to seek out their true nature, that Buddha nature. So to say otherwise, from a Buddhist perspective, is just contradicting the basic teachings of the Buddha. Everybody has a right to know their own nature. Everybody has the Buddha nature. A Buddhist will tell you it's more efficient, and it probably is, to go through the process on the path of the Buddha as a Buddhist. But many people in the world aren't Buddhists. So for those that aren't, the easy way is, and what I actually did myself for 4 or 5 years, extensively and very sincerely, just adopt Buddhist practices while in the framework of a Christian theistic model, with all the pantheon of saints and goddesses, and see where it takes you. And then practice both simultaneously. Employ what's the good in Buddhism in a Christian framework. There's no contradiction there. Ultimately, it is true. A Christian will have to give up the idea of a creator, because as one's understanding evolves, then the idea of a creator becomes less and less viable. And the emptiness, interconnectedness of all things and come into play. And one naturally evolves out of the idea of a supreme being. But this is true for Buddhists as well, because although most Buddhists will say they don't believe in a creator, if they understand their own mind, they will see by introspection that they have the idea of, a supreme being in their mind. They haven't evolved past that point in a Buddhist framework yet. So they share views that are very similar as far as what they understand with their heart and are capable of describing. as Christians do, for very, very long time along the path. And the subtle view of a creator is given up way high up on the Bodhisattva path. It's not just something that we give lip service to and say, oh, well, I'm a Buddhist and therefore I don't believe in a creator. If you notice your actions, your thoughts, and your sense of accountability, and your sense of vulnerability, sense of fear of death, you will see that basically, whatever you may say otherwise, you do believe in a creator. And this is very common knowledge amongst people that have developed any real skill in Buddhist practice. It's very, very common in Indian temples where debate is practiced extensively. For debating partners in a Buddhist temple to assume different positions. One will assume the position of a Buddhist, for example. The other will assume the position of a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu, a particular school of Hinduism, like the Nyaya, or those who follow Samkara. The debaters will assume a superior, which is the Buddhist position, and an inferior position, which could be the Christian or another position, another Hindu school, for example. It's not necessarily the case that the Buddhist will defeat the inferior school, because the other debater, through his knowledge and realization, may, through his own understanding, understand that particular school, subtle aspects of its philosophy, where he can expound it and defend it against the onslaught of his debating partner, because the debating partner may not understand Buddhism as well as his opponent understands Hinduism or Christianity. And the person of the inferior viewpoint will actually defeat, and it happens regularly, the person with the superior view. So what does this all mean to us? It means that we cannot, as Buddhists, say, oh, I don't believe in a creator God. I don't believe in an eternal being, and so forth. When that understanding is not developed in a way that's meaningful until very high up on the Buddhist ladder, perhaps an 8th stage bodhisattva is where that would begin. Until that time, we do believe in substantiality. We do believe in the reality of objects. We do believe in ourselves as a person, and so forth. And to claim otherwise is ludicrous. And we have to, if we understand that much, then we'll understand that, yes, we say, yeah, there's no creator in Buddhism, and there's no eternal beings, and there's no eternal things, and the whole concept of things is ludicrous because everything's empty. Well, we can say that all we want, but to develop that understanding requires a lot of skill, a lot of meditation practice, a lot of sacrifice, discipline, and then, then we will evolve past that viewpoint. So until that time comes, we shouldn't think ourselves so superior to all Christians or all Hindus. Many Hindus and many Christians and those of other faiths have evolved way past our own understanding as a Buddhist. It's up to us as a Buddhist to really see the distinction clearly. And that's how compassion arises, and the capacity to really care about other people and love other people and being able to help other people happens. It doesn't happen otherwise. There's no other way. It's pretty straightforward. So any Buddhist that says a Christian cannot become a Buddhist is probably a Christian. A Buddhist will say, yes, of course, you have the Buddha nature. All living beings have the Buddha nature. And to say that a Christian cannot know his Buddha nature and practice Buddhism is ridiculous.